So something I think about when I'm setting up a still life and when I'm drawing one is just the relationships between all of the different objects. It reminds me of that Winslow Homer painting we looked at earlier of the guy on the beach after the hurricane, I think it's called. What draws me to that painting so much, I kept talking about the design of it and how everything is interacting with something else. Nothing's really in isolation. Even that island in the distance with the palm trees on it had like a relationship with the sky and clouds above it. These kinds of paintings, I mean, really any painting, I think, is all about those relationships, how one thing relates to another can be more important than the thing itself. So as I put in all these objects, as I'm drawing all these shapes, carving up the picture plane, I want to think about positive and negative space. I want to think about where the objects are overlapping, how they measure up to each other horizontally and vertically, like this spout of the blue pitcher comes over the side of the lemon here. I want to make sure the lemon is not too large. So using the negative space between them to help figure out where they land in space. And then these little pockets of negative space around them. All these different relationships are really what's going to drive the feeling of the painting and just dictate the path of the viewer or the viewer's visual path through the painting. I think that stuff is really important when you're considering your composition, when you're drawing your composition, because we're just setting ourselves up. And once we feel good enough about our drawing with proportions and where everything is going to land, then we can focus more on things like color, value, temperature, edges. But we want to make sure the design of our picture is going to hold up. So in judging how far over the edge of this cube shape is going to be, I can look at the handle up here above it, but I can also look at the edge over here and the edge of the photo. If the dimensions of my picture are proportional to the photo, which they are because I measured, I should be able to judge this negative space, like the air next to the cube and the blue pitcher. This empty space here has a shape on its own. So drawing that negative space and using that negative space and thinking of it as a shape, it's going to help me, it's going to help inform the positive shapes. I think I made the picture too wide, so I just had to erase what I had. Try again. We could just cheat and look at use a ruler in Photoshop here. Let's try that real quick. So I can share this with you in the chat too. But if we look at the halfway vertically and horizontally, we can see that this picture crosses over the halfway mark just a little bit, this mouth cast thing. also crosses over that halfway mark in the other direction. So that helps me too. We don't have to use a full-on grid to find everything. If you want to, if you want to print it out and use a grid system, that's okay with me. Whatever makes you comfortable and confident. Let me put that in the chat real quick. There it is. But I'm always going to recommend doing it the old-fashioned way. Just comparative measuring while you're drawing. There's no shortcut to good drawing skills, and there's something that you have to just maintain over time. So let's see, halfway, somewhere around here. So I know this crosses over a little bit in this direction, this overlap right around here. And if we were doing this from direct observation, or drawing, painting a still life from life, like it's right there in front of us, we could also use a viewfinder. That always helps me get dialed in on my composition too. This the spout of the pitcher is a pretty complicated shape. So you could also think about the negative space above and below it too to help get everything in the right spot. So take your time with that. So the more I'm drawing here, the more marks that I'm making. I'm not trying to make anything more detailed or more complex. I'm just trying to make it more accurate. So in a way, every time I draw a line, I'm also erasing one. Each line I'm drawing is a replacement for the line that was there before it, because I don't want to overload it with too many pencil marks. I want to make this a painting and not a drawing. But I just want to make sure everything is in the right spot so it's a drawing that I can trust. I mentioned earlier, having a drawing you can trust just gives you more time and space to focus on everything else about painting that makes painting so tricky. I really like this negative shape right here between everything. I feel like the whole painting's kind of rotating around that. I was talking with a student yesterday who was having trouble drawing with a really light touch all the lines that he made were really, really dark. And because of that, they were really hard to erase. And his whole drawing just gets darker and darker because he kind of has nowhere to go value wise. So my recommendation to him was to do some sketching with a ballpoint pen. If you're drawing with I feel like if you're drawing with a pencil, somewhere in the back of your mind, you know you could erase it if you had to. So we're not as careful. When you draw with a ballpoint pen, you have to be really sensitive in having that light touch and not pushing down too hard because you can't erase. And you have to build it up more slowly. So if that's something you struggle with, especially with these initial sketches for a painting, if you feel like the lines are coming through too dark, practice some sketching with a ballpoint pen. Not on your painting though, don't do that. Because that will definitely won't erase. Unless you want to see it and you like the quality of the ballpoint pen, that's another thing. But okay, I think all of my shapes here are starting to add up. I haven't even gone into that mouth shape yet because I want to make sure everything's in the right spot before I get too complicated in there. I like this little gap over here, this negative space of the fabric and the wall behind it. That wasn't on purpose when I was setting it up, but once I was taking the photo, I ended up keeping that in there because it's like an interesting little border right there. So every little compositional element has a purpose. Even if we're not sure what it is, I mean, something about that shape over there, I feel like kind of keeps us in the painting. Maybe, I don't really know, but thinking of all the objects and even their light and shadow shapes too, I think shadows are a compositional element just as much as an object. Like this corner of the cube right here, got this cast shadow right here. Every line and shape has a purpose. And if we think of it in that way, it's easier for us to not just paint the object, but paint what it's doing. Which can be a strange and kind of new concept, but going back to that Winslow Homer painting again from earlier with all the seaweed and the boat and the waves, in addition to just what the figure on its own is doing, every little element has a purpose. They're all doing something. They're all serving the picture in some way, even if it's hard to describe in words. We want to be tuned into that and not just copying what we're seeing, but understanding how it serves the greater whole. Which goes back to what I was saying about relationships between things in the beginning. Has anyone here ever drawn or painted a plaster cast like this before?
I think maybe I've done like a mug or something with some molded thing on it.
Okay. They're really
With a face on it, I should say.
Yeah. I want to, they have a bunch of these at this one of the schools I teach at, so I want to just photograph all of them and share them with my online emeritus students.
They're
But this class,
terrific for studying.
what was that?
They're terrific for studying. Yeah, because
Yeah.
they're idealized, right?
Yeah. And since it's all one color, we can really think about that collision of light and shadow, form shadows versus cast shadows. There's reflected light bouncing up into this, into the lips here. Really clear cut and simple, which because it's so simple in that regard, we can spend more time focusing on the complexity of all the forms. Like lips are really, a mouth is a really complicated thing to draw and paint. So without worrying too much about temperature, there are some temperature shifts in there, but when it's so simple, it kind of gives us room to get more complicated with it, if that makes sense. So maybe there'll be more of that this semester. So if you can see my drawing, I know it's hard to pick up on the pencil lines sometimes, but it's pretty simple. I just want to make sure everything's in the right spot. Maybe this lemon is a little too small. So in drawing the lemon right here, I can think about this negative shape, like this empty space around the lemon and how that interacts with the picture right here. And I can draw that shape as much as I'm drawing the positive shape of the lemon itself. And then right here, especially, I can anticipate this is going to be really light and bright where the lemon has a highlight. So I want to be extra light with my pencil lines, just knowing that a thin wash of yellow is probably not going to be enough to cover that up. Although I guess cadmium yellow is really opaque, so that might save us in the end. But either way, I'm going to lighten all of my lines a little bit. I want to make sure you can see them here, but I'm going to start to erase quite a bit. I have this kneaded eraser. I'm just really gently just brushing this across the entire thing really lightly. Nice having such a small group in this class. My Monday watercolor class has like over 40 people in it. So when we do a critique, it's like 2 hours of talking, and that's rushing through. So it's nice we can all take our time and talk about art and stuff and then still have 2 hours to paint. So I wish it was a little more evenly split, but now that we are here, it is nice having a smaller group. Sorry about the construction noises that are happening right outside my door. I hope it's not too loud on your end. I'm just refilling my pigments here. I think I've mentioned it before, but I'll say it again. I always make sure all of my pigments are out, even if I look at something and I'm like, okay, this painting we're working on today, there's not a lot of red in it, so I'm not gonna bother putting out cadmium red. I put out all of my pigments because you never know what you're going to be reaching for. And to take the time to go dig around and search for a pigment, to then put it out on the palette, to then mix it into your color, that time is really precious. That thing that you were after might slip away while you were digging around in the paint box. So I like having everything out all the time. Just it's there. If I need it, I can just grab it. Because sometimes that feeling of like, oh, what if I add just a little bit of that color? That feeling is so fragile. It's so easy to let that get scared away. I think what we can do to start is just block out the background and this ground plane. It's a nice balance of warm and cool. I'll start off with the warmer fabric in the back there. The only light shapes we're really going to want to protect are maybe here on the picture. Maybe we put some masking fluid on those tiny little specular highlights there. Everything else in here on this, the big mouth, and here on the cube, is just a little bit not quite pure white. So I think we could get away with not masking that off. But I will mask off these little tiny guys right there. Sorry, I just stepped away for a minute there. I was grabbing some dish soap. So with the masking fluid, I use a brush that I don't really care about as much. Sorry, brush. I don't care about you. And I put a little bit of dish soap on it just to protect it from the masking fluid. I don't use masking fluid a whole lot. But when I do, I just try to protect my brush. So I've got a little bit of dish fluid here. I put it in this little shell. Shells make really good tiny palettes. But I'm just going to coat my brush in a tiny bit of dish soap just to protect it from the masking fluid. Not a whole lot. You don't want to have too like soap flying around your painting, but just gonna dip this in here. Maybe people, if you use masking fluid more often, you're like less cautious and scared than me, but I just don't use it a lot, so it always freaks me out a little. So I'm just gonna do these tiny little highlights right here. There's two right there. There's one up here, like near this top edge. The smaller one right here. And I don't want to overload this too much. I like that one on the spout. I think that's like an interesting shape. And I think that's about it. There are other highlights on there, but I'm just going to focus on the useful ones that I like. That goes for anything in a painting, from any photo reference. We don't have to copy everything down. So I'm going to go wash this brush off before this all dries. I'll be right back. So other than those little highlights we just covered, move this light a little bit. Most of the larger white shapes in the mouth here. I mean, the lemon as a whole is pretty bright. When I look at the reference and I squint, the light side of the lemon is a similar value to the background, just more saturated in that yellow. I'm just trying to think about what do I want to avoid with this initial wash. I think I'll paint around the picture just to be safe, even though for the most part it's darker than the background. That blue is so saturated that I don't really want that light warm color to overlap with the dark blue color, because since they're sort of complements, they might kind of cancel each other out. We'll start out with this 1 inch brush. And then I have my smaller, this 3/4 inch. And when I look at the background, it is light and warm. So I have some yellow ochre here, lots of water. If this is too yellow or too warm, I can desaturate a little bit, the tiny bit of ultramarine blue to get more of that dull beige color. So I'm desaturating it, but that blue is also going to make it darker. So I want to keep that in mind, add a little bit more water so I don't get too dark for the background. Because when I look at the background, it's very light and bright. Maybe I'll do a second version right here that's even brighter because there are some of those variations in the light and shadow. They're darker and a little cooler still. So maybe those will have a little bit more blue in them. I'm gonna use this smaller brush, I think. So don't forget about this little gray area here on the right side. I'm going to start off with just kind of covering the whole area with this light wash, and then I can add more pigment to the different shapes, wet into wet. But I just want to start out with getting like the silhouette of these shapes right first. Hopefully it doesn't dry too quickly on me. So this area behind the lemon is especially bright, so I'm using pretty much just water in this area and just letting the pigment fill in around it. That'll give it more of a glow right there. So down here in the bottom right is where we can push that wet into wet. Slightly darker, slightly cooler shadow right here. So I added a little bit more blue. Really, really subtle. Same with up here, sort of above and behind the picture. And then definitely back here behind that picture handle, there's even a cast shadow on the wall. So we're going to push that darker. And again, this is ultramarine blue with some yellow ochre and lots of water. Even though this is a shadow, it's still important for us to compare it to everything else in the painting. This shadowed part of the fabric is still acting like a light shape compared to the darkness of the picture handle, if that makes sense. I wish there was less of a glare on my page. Sorry about that. So with all these little differences that we're seeing in those shadows back there, it is really important to keep an eye on the big picture, keep stepping back and think about how those values are really sort of compressed. If we think about the value scale, they're really close to each other in the context of the bigger picture. So we always want to keep in mind our lightest light, our darkest dark. The picture as a whole, that ultramarine blue is going to be really, really dark. So much darker than these shadows right here. So my point is don't push these shadows too hard. And we're just getting started too. This is just our initial wash to get going. And I will do the same thing for the ground plane. Maybe it's a little bit darker, but barely. It's a pretty similar value to up here. What's different is the temperature. Instead of being light and warm, it's light and cool. Or it's cool at least just in the context of that warmer fabric. I think on its own, it's really just like a neutral gray. So I'm gonna grab some ultramarine blue, some burnt sienna, and try and get a nice even mix for an even neutral gray. And I'll just fill this in all pretty much the same. There are some reflections in there that we can address later. I think that's a little too light. I'm going to add a little bit more pigment. See, this is looking a little too brown. So I'll add more blue, but adding more blue is going to darken it. Color mixing can be a Rubik's Cube. If you fix one thing, you changed another thing. And it's all this counterbalancing and multitasking. So now this temperature looks better, but the value's too dark. So I'll just do a lighter version up here with more water. And this darker one will come in handy for those cast shadows in there. I'm gonna add a tiny bit of cerulean in here. There's something that's really kind of like a saturated blue down here that I feel like we could push. So there's a tiny bit of cerulean in this. And it doesn't have to be too dark. Just has to be a little bit darker than, like, use this light shape on the cube as a guide, or the light hitting this mouth shape up here. If it's a little bit darker than those, then we're in the ballpark. There's a really subtle reflection right here off of that brick. And I want to see if I can do this wet into wet here. I think the cast shadows, we should wait for it to dry. Hope we're all remembering to breathe through our nose. I'm gonna clean off my palette here. Actually, you know what? Before I do that, just looking at these colors, so something I do sometimes, mostly because I'm lazy, but also because it adds to the cohesion of all the colors in a painting, is if you can reuse something, only if you're sure that it's similar enough, you can reuse a color for somewhere else. So somewhere else that I'm seeing dark and cool is on the mouth cast over here. So thinking about all the light and shadow shapes in here, when I squint, the shadows are a little bit darker than what's happening down here in the ground plane, but they're in the same world. They're darker and cooler, neutral grays with a little bit of wiggle room temperature wise. But I think this color would be a good temperature and a good value for just mapping out the shadow shapes I'm seeing on this mouth cast here. So let me share my screen real quick. Thinking again about light and shadow shapes and mapping out the general shadows. I'm going to Photoshop something real quick here. What I want to do right now is separate light and dark. I'm not going to go too dark on the shadows. I don't want to commit to those too dark. I want to keep everything pretty light. But just as an example, I'm going to draw this in the way I'm seeing it as far as separating light and shadow. This cast shadow comes down along here. And despite all of the nuance in all of the reflected light that we're seeing, the differences in edges, I mean, the differences in edges are really important. We are going to look out for those. But I just want to show you how I'm seeing this whole mass of one unified shadow shape first, and then we'll go in and look at the reflected light within that later. A little bit of a shadow here, barely. That's like not even really a shadow. It's just kind of less bright than what's getting direct light right here. This is a little bit of a form shadow here. That kind of tapers off into a really soft edge there. But the main thing here is just this larger shape, seeing this as a whole unified thing. This too tapers off in this direction up here. Get some half tones. I'm not going to paint this in purple. I'm just using the purple just to highlight the way that I'm seeing it. But that's like how I'm going to view this shadow going into it. I'm not yet going to think too much about like all these different values in here. What matters to me right now is the shape of the shadow and the kind of edge that it has. And I'm going to keep my shadow at least as bright as the brightest part of this, which is, probably somewhere in this realm, versus going this dark over here would be too dark. Especially this dark in here is also too dark. We'll keep it somewhere near like a kind of a light mid-tone, like a middle of the road mid-tone. And then from there we can go in and make it more complex. So I hope that makes sense. And we've done it on a few different paintings now, but mapping out the shadow shapes in a unified way, anticipating going in again later and making it more complex. Is anyone confused by that? Or can I explain it in a different way? Let me get a smaller brush. Even this far edge of the cast shadow over here has a pretty soft edge as that tapers off. So I'm going to use lots of water, keep everything pretty soft and light for now. I just want to get the shape right, get the edges right. And what I'm asking myself is, what is the light touching directly? And how does that transition um, unfold? Anytime we're looking at shadow shapes, it's important to think about, or a way that I think about it is, what does the light source itself see? Like what would its view of this, like what is it touching directly? That's like, what does this light bulb see on the mouth? It's almost like if you were looking for shadows with a flashlight, you wouldn't find any because the light source is what's creating the shadows, but from its perspective, it can't actually see them. I hate this glare. I wish there wasn't a glare right now. Yeah, it's a little better. So these really subtle value shifts up here, I'm just using water mostly and pulling around the pigment that's already on the paper. Just like we do with the whole painting, we can do with each object on its own too. Think about the brightest bright, the darkest dark, the difference between the two, and everything happening between those. Each object has a value scale on its own. Mouths are especially tricky because of how like emotive they can be. Is that the right word? Emotive? Is that a word? They convey a lot of emotion. So they're really expressive. So every little micro expression in a mouth. It's like when we look at the Mona Lisa and we wonder if she's smiling or not. We're so good at that as human beings that when we're drawing and painting a mouth, if it's just a little bit off in the wrong way, something's going to be look really weird about it. So right now, I'm not painting that really sharp cast shadow between the lips, like along the line of the lips. That will be, we can punch that through later. What I'm looking at first is this softer form shadow above it of the top lip and how it kind of rolls back towards the light. we want to have that transition in there first. We'll start out with lighter and softer shapes. Later, we can always get darker and sharper. Remember, that's like our overall trajectory. So I have 2 jars of water, one for cleaning my brush, one for painting. So the water for painting is really clean. So as I go back in with clean water, make sure it's doesn't have any pigment in it. I'm using this to pull around the pigment that I have on there already. So I'm just being really careful about all of the different transitions and edges. I'm moving the water around. I'm like destroying as many edges as I'm creating. Just trying to get all those. Again, I'm anticipating like the sharper shapes later on. I'm mostly looking at the softer transitions. So now I'm dropping in a little bit more of that bluish pigment over here. And then this cube over here, which is also plaster, has a really similar thing going on with the values in this shadow shape here. So this top line of this plane goes right under the base of this picture. So just in looking at this now, I kind of know I'm going to have to go in later and darken some of this shadow right here. Because even though this is a shadow on this cube right here, it's darker than the light shape right out here on this side. It's also lighter than this shadow back here. So for all of this to make sense, I'm going to have to darken this later. So I've got some yellow ochre, ultramarine blue, and a little bit of burnt sienna to make another dark gray, darker than the one we just used. And I want to go in and put in these shadows, these cast shadows from the brick and from the cube. I don't want to go too dark on these. Wherever the values are at, we just want to make sure they're they're existing within a context. So to judge a value, we have to look at everything around it. This one is kind of tighter up against these objects, so there's less light getting in, so it is a little bit darker. But where that cube is hitting the ground plane right here is the darkest dark in that area. So as long as we have room to get darker there later, we should be okay. As this goes up this like side wall of the cube here, which it looks like I gave too much space, that's okay. There's a lot of reflected light coming from that warm fabric behind it, so this gets lighter and warmer. But again, keep in mind the context, it's going to run into the light hitting the fabric in this negative shape right here, so it has to be darker and cooler than that. So darker and cooler than what's happening back here, but lighter and warmer than this one right here. So I'll grab a little bit more of that yellow ochre, a little bit more water. I'm gonna clean off my palette again and just get ready for this blue picture. We'll do that next. That too will take more than one layer. So I'm just gonna start off with blocking in the general color and shape. So just looking at it, I think what I'm gonna do is paint it mostly all the same blue, like the general ultramarine blue. This like form shadow happening on the left, I think we could do wet into wet with a darker blue that goes into the handle back here. But then that sharper shape of like the edge of the spout right here and this cast shadow across the top lip of it there, those will be wet into dry. So we'll just keep that in mind as we go. I'm gonna use a slightly bigger brush. With every brushstroke that I make, I'm always trying to use the right size and shape brush for it. It's a pretty deep and dark saturated blue, even where the light is hitting it. So not the highlight, but the greater light shape. If we look at that and squint, the light part here on the picture is still a lot darker than everything else happening around it. A little bit of lighter reflected light, lighter and warmer reflected light here from that warm background, and then kind of lighter and more neutral over here too. So that's something we can be aware of right now too. Also a tiny light shape up here, the inside of the picture. Our eye level is like just right above the top plane here. So we're just barely seeing that flattened out ellipse across the top. It's almost totally flat. So I want to use plenty of water and pigment here. Oops. I'm just going to unify this whole shape first, and then I'll go in and start lifting some stuff out. So as a form kind of turns towards the shadow, right before that, where that form shadow begins, is going to be the most saturated area of it. So the bluest blue we're going to see is right along this transition here. It's really subtle. It's mostly the same blue throughout, but right here is where it really gets super strong before it gets darker. So what I want to do next is lift out a little bit along each side edge here. So I took that wet rag, rolled it up. A little bit on this side too. Now I'll take a smaller brush, the same blue, try and rebuild some of these. So some of these we will come back in and do wet into dry, but I think wet into wet is going to help too. So it'll be a combination of both, which will give us a good variety in our edges. Try and smooth this out a little bit. Then I'll grab that same dark blue and get into this spout situation up here. So I'm leaving a little bit of that white shape for the inside of the spout there. That whole breathing through your nose thing really comes in handy if you're doing these tiny little brush strokes, trying to get them perfect, and they're doing construction on your neighbor's house. Right as the brush touches the paper, they like rip open the saw. And it just sounds like it's happening like right next to my head. It's so loud. So I'll sharpen this edge up more later. But right here towards the edge of the spout, this is a pretty smooth and slow transition. So I think wet into wet will be better for that. Let's see how that kind of comes down from there. And then the darker dark on the handle, just be aware of those overlaps in the form. This inside edge being on the bottom of the handle here, closer to the picture, and then on the outside edge as it moves away from it. Just pay close attention to all those little plane changes. The way they overlap does matter. All right, so I'm gonna grab some yellow, some cadmium yellow here with this yellow lemon. I'm gonna share my screen real quick just to talk about the lemon. So just like with the picture, the most saturated part of this lemon, this is a fake lemon, by the way. It's from the still life object closet at school. If it looks fake, that's because it is, but it works for our painting. But the closest part of the object to the light source is where we're getting the brightest color here. So all those specular little highlights there, closest part of the lemon to the light source, stepping just outside of that, still part of like the greater light shape, that's where we're getting the most saturated color right along here. As it starts to turn towards the shadow, we're going to lose saturation. It gets darker and just a little bit cooler over here, but we're starting out really light and bright yellow right here. This gets more saturated with a little bit more red, and then it'll start to cool off going in that direction. So I'm starting off with cad yellow and plenty of water. Remember, cad yellow is really opaque. Keep that in mind as you're putting it down. Going right up against the edge of the shape I created earlier when I painted the background around it. Don't want to leave any gaps. I'm going to use this rag to pull out some of that highlight. I'm going to wrap the rag around the edge of the brush handle there. And then as we get a little bit more saturated, I'm adding just the tiniest amount of cad red to get more of an orangey, really saturated orange color. If you have lemon yellow, now's the time to use it. But cad yellow is working just fine too. So we're getting more saturated, kind of more warmer towards an orange as we move away from that highlight. Maybe I should back up with this glare. Trying to find the right angle so it's not as shiny. And then as we get darker, more towards the shadow, I'm grabbing a little bit of ultramarine blue and some yellow ochre and mixing that in to the color I already have, which should be darker and a little bit cooler. Again, not necessarily a cool color on its own. The coolness is just in the context of everything else happening on the lemon. So that wet into wet transition, the way it's interacting with the paper, I like what that's doing to create that texture of the lemon skin. So I might just leave that for right now. There is a darker shadow where the lemon's coming into contact with the top of this cast. I can push that later. For right now, I think it's important to put the cast shadow of the lemon on that top plane though. So I'm going to clean this palette off. It's hard to say exactly what color that might be of the cast shadow of the lemon down there, other than a dark gray. I'm going to use some alizarin crimson and some blue to make it dark. I can desaturate it with some yellow. Remember, yellow is the opposite of purple. But I think introducing some purple into that shadow will help counter the yellow of the lemon above it. Probably too much yellow that I added. But this shadow also plays a big part in just connecting these objects to what's happening with the picture over here too. So the yellow's kind of bleeding into it. Maybe I should have just waited. I'll just let that sit before I push it any darker. The one thing I want to do while I have this really dark blue going, I'm going to add alizarin crimson to ultramarine blue to get really extra dark, maybe a little bit of burnt sienna. And I want to push that cast shadow across the top of the picture here. I'm going to use mostly ultramarine blue though. This is like the darkest blue I could possibly get with this palette. So this cast shadow is dark and sharp across the middle here, but as we hit the reflected light on that left side, it falls off a little bit. So I'm just going to use clean water, try and pull this pigment over, and then reuse it down here for this little divot. So we're almost out of time. I wanted to get back into this mouth shape over here because there's a lot of fun stuff happening in here. So this week and next week, because we don't have class next week because it's spring break, take your time building up these layers. We're moving a little bit more slowly on this painting, which gives us room to maneuver and think about what we're doing and make really thoughtful decisions. Just grabbing more blue here. You can see on this picture, though, just building up these shapes slowly. Being aware of those transitions, if it's more of a sharper transition like the edge right here, better to wait for it to dry and then find that wet into dry edge. See here it gets kind of lighter and softer, so I'm just adding a little bit of water, blending that out a little bit. And then up here it gets darker and sharper. Oh man. So just like we're seeing on the picture here, just think about building up those layers slowly over time and how you can push the values, the edges, the temperature shifts. Think about each move that you're making. And just try and have a reason for it. Each brush stroke, just try to be aware. I don't want you to overthink it and be paralyzed with fear about everything that you're doing, but I just don't want you to get lost and kind of on autopilot for too long. Painting thoughtfully like this, you just have to pay attention. There's lots of different kinds of painting. Sometimes when I'm painting, I'll be like listening to music more, being a little bit looser, but sometimes it's like music would be too much. Like right now, I feel really focused on what this picture is doing. It's like hard to even talk while I'm doing it. And that's a good thing. I mean, it's hard for me to teach to paint and talk at the same time, but that's the kind of headspace you want to be in for working like this. Use a bigger brush for this move right here. Not having this shadow here is bothering me, so I'm going to push that in real quick. Totally forgot about this brick over here. I'm gonna use some alizarin crimson, some raw umber, and some blue to desaturate it. Plenty of blue to desaturate it. Pretty muddy, just a brick color, but still kind of just leaning towards brown, I guess. But basically just like a warm gray. Maybe I'll recycle this darker brick color for beneath the lemon. To give the lemon more of a home up there and connecting it to that plane. And that might be it for me, folks. Take your time with this. I'm rushing just to try and get in as much as I can during class here. But I'd love for you to just take your time traveling around this painting one step at a time. We've got 2 weeks. So enjoy yourself with this. Take as much time as you need. already. I'm gonna let this dry before removing that masking fluid and maybe probably having to block in a little bit of those highlights because they're a little bit big.